All right, welcome everybody to DevOps Summit 2021. Let me start with my topic. Have you ever wondered why DevOps sometimes doesn't work in your organization? Have you ever wondered why you're still experiencing the same pitfalls in your DevOps process? Have you also wondered why there is no way to say when something will get delivered? And have you also wondered why do you have overworked staff? If yes is an answer to any of these questions, or you're just wondering what I will be talking about, please stick around. I will be talking about Chronicles of DevOps Antipatterns, or just generally DevOps Antipatterns. Today, it's very popular to talk about DevOps and DevOps best practices, but randomly I see somebody talks about DevOps pitfalls and some mistakes that happen in organizations that try to introduce DevOps. So I've collected a list throughout the years of reading multiple books, also being in the fields, and have a list of most common DevOps anti-patterns that I'll be spending time talking to you today. Who am I? My name is Marko Zlatanovic. I'm a senior DevOps architect at DigitalOnUs that is owned by Tech Mahindra. Beside work, I love exploring new hobbies and activities with my family. I have a 5-year-old daughter that finds it very amusing to explore the new stuff and new world with her family, which is great for now. We like spending time outside together. I like working out and learning new technologies. Now, the more important part, who am I technically? I've been 15 years in infrastructure and IT in general. Out of those 15 years, I have 7 years in the clouds, 5 years in general in DevOps every day. I've started from a specialist role, from analyst and specialist role to a SRE. I went to an architect, senior architect, implementation lead, director of practice. I've started really from the beginning and then learned a lot of new things and new tricks and then improved in my career. During that time, I was collecting a lot of DevOps stories, and which I still do, and I really enjoy those stories and those processes that organizations go through. And with all the success, also there's a lot of failures that I collected. Some of them are mine, some of them are from other people and other organizations, but I'm happy to share them. So what will be on the agenda today? I will just a little bit, because I'm pretty sure somebody else will also cover the topic of DevOps, but just a little bit mention what DevOps is and what are those ingredients that make DevOps so irresistible and popular today. After that, most of my time I'll focus on Chronicles of DevOps Antipatterns, or just simply DevOps Antipatterns. And I will wrap it up at the end, and I'll have some book recommendations that I will share with everybody, because some of the books that are written and that I will share are great information for somebody starting in DevOps or being very mature in DevOps, just to look and compare. All right, without further ado, let me start with what is DevOps? I've collected certain definitions. I've seen multiple definitions of DevOps. It could be a culture, it could be people, it could be tools. But all of these definitions, regardless of which one you look at, talk about 4 main pillars of DevOps, or 4 main pillars of attention and focus. Those pillars are culture, automation, metrics, and sharing, or shortly said, CAMs. Culture is about changing the norms by which your teams operate. Automation is all about freeing human capital from the mundane. It's about empowering people to do their jobs safely and autonomously. Metrics are the way you tell if something's working or not. The absence of errors is just not sufficient. Sharing is the idea that knowledge wants to be free. Humans often learn best when they're teaching something to someone else. And I want to add another point. DevOps should be lean. The idea of that is delivering smaller, more frequent software updates is a preferred approach, and that sometimes a minimal product in the hands of a customer is better than waiting 6 months for a more flashed out version. Definition 2, this is more of what DevOps is focusing on. DevOps should be about people first, then process, and then tools. business, development, and operations teams should be working together. You need people on board and ready for change. Once the people are on board, they need to be involved and engaged with creating the process. Once the process is created, you now have necessary input to pick the right tool. You can't choose a tool and then tell the people that they have to change all their processes and the way how they do things. Our brains are just not wired like that. Our brains will immediately be hostile to that type of approach. Example, if you don't have a culture where automated testing is valuable, the tool, regardless of how fancy it is, doesn't provide any value. DevOps isn't about tools, but about how teams work together. Don't get me wrong. There's definitely technology involved, but honestly, the tools are far less important than the people. But second, let's talk about DevOps antipatterns. All right, here's the list of all most common DevOps antipatterns I've seen throughout the years. I will be talking about each and every one of them. Some of them I'll spend a little bit more time, some of them a bit less. But in any organization that has or call itself DevOps organization, you will see one of these patterns or anti-patterns. The way how you can see now the presentation, I will talk about the symptoms of these anti-patterns, and then also what can you do from a DevOps perspective to remove them. All right, let's start. The first one, the Paternalist Syndrome. I call this the Paternalist Syndrome, named after the parental relationship one group assumes over others. The Paternalist Syndrome relies on gatekeepers to decide how and when work gets done. This concentration in power initially seems like a prudent decision, but can quickly devolve into a productivity strain. Lack of trust examples, for example. It manifests in the form of handoffs, approvals, and overly restrictive access control. Instead of solving these issues through collaboration, organizations instead erect barriers between teams, filling the void with process, access restrictions, and handoffs. So how can DevOps help here? DevOps can create repeatable, predictable process, which will increase collaboration among teams, decrease unnecessary gates and handoffs. You can share responsibilities for the application production environment. You cannot have only one person have access to production. Being able to confirm that something is working is way more valuable than just being able to confirm there are no errors. Empower development teams with the tools and authority to own their systems, or simply said, having skin in the game. As the level of automation and the amount of shared responsibility increases, the incentives for information hoarding begins to crumble. All right, let's go to the second one. Operational blindness. This anti-pattern is about different ways DevOps organizations look at metrics and what they tell you about how your system is performing in the business context. Teams very often rely on easily obtained metrics that offer no real business context into how the system is performing. While you have generic performance numbers, you are effectively blind from an operational viewpoint. Imagine the following scenario. A random alert that has general description goes off and notifies operations team. The operations team reviews the system and assumes everything's okay. Then they forward the ticket to developers, who in return conclude the system is behaving normal in pre-production. Two teams then sit with each other, go through the logs to understand what might have caused the issue. But has anybody wondered, is user experience okay? Is there any network outage? This is a very common scenario of when alert happens. And most of the time in this scenario, whoever caught it is sitting there hoping that the alert will go away because it's really hard to prove what happened. So now, DevOps approach. How can DevOps help here? Understanding the product you're supporting. Go beyond the system metrics and develop custom metrics for your application. Getting the log message in the right category should be as important as logging the message in the first place. Too many downstream actions like search, as we saw in the example, filtering, and even monitoring depend on the categorization of the log message being correct. Never settle for only the metrics you currently have. You should be continuously asking yourself questions about your systems and ensuring that you can answer those questions through metrics. You shouldn't only log for troubleshooting purposes, but you can think about logging for also audit purposes. Remember, central pillar of DevOps is to empower teams and to share. Third, anti-pattern, data instead of information. This anti-pattern is about dashboards, or about how the numbers and the metrics get presented after being collected. Most common symptom about this is complex dashboards. And one of the main reasons why is teams that will be using those dashboards are the teams creating those dashboards. So how often have you heard this, a similar discussion where someone from the higher management or even executive managers just walk by the teams or central unit where you do the monitoring? They look at the TV, they see different colors, see different dashboards, say, this looks great. He stops for a second, looks at it, has no idea what it is, just walks away. That's a complex dashboard. Anyone should, with looking 2-3 widgets, 2 to 4 widgets at one point at the top, understand what that dashboard is about. They should not maybe get the context of the dashboard, but they should know what the dashboard is all about. So symptoms. Data is just a raw, uncategorized facts, but when you take that data, give it context and structure it, only then becomes information. Poorly visualized metrics are useless, becoming nothing else than sea of numbers in which the original gets lost in the noise. How can DevOps help here? This is why starting with your user in mind is a dashboard best practice. Understanding the motivations for what the user will be doing. You should think about the user and the key bits of information they will need when viewing this dashboard. Think of the big 2 to 4 items that you think will be the most likely reason your intended users are coming to the dashboard. The first row of the dashboard should be reserved for your most important metrics. When they fail in the grouping of metrics is immaterial compared to how quickly you can get access to that data. Fourth anti-pattern, quality as a condiment. This anti-pattern is about testing, or better to say, lack of testing across DevOps practices. What happens usually? What are the symptoms? Waiting until the end of the development lifecycle to test. Unit tests written by the testing or QA teams, which is sometimes not that bad, but most of the times QA teams and the testing teams do not have sufficient requirements to write those tests. So what they will do, they'll just write tests about tests. Symptoms. So imagine you're in one of those quick serve restaurants where you move from station to station, adding ingredients to your final dish. Each part of your meal is separate ingredients that comes together at the end of the line. Once you get to the end of the line, you might ask for a condiment to enhance the dish. This is exactly what many organizations do with their quality strategy. So how can DevOps help? Think of the testing pyramid. Starts from the bottom, it goes unit tests, integrated tests in the middle, and then end-to-end tests at the top. If properly designed, any unit test failure should result in higher tests in the stack failing pretty reliably. Unit tests should be written by the developers writing the component or units under the tests. The reason being that the unit test should be run regularly by a developer during the creation of that unit. Test coverage is an example of vanity metric. What is a vanity metric? That's a metric that's just sitting there, provides no value, and it has no purpose. Coverage doesn't necessarily speak to the quality of the tests or what specifically is being tested. Test coverage is great, but not having 100% test coverage doesn't mean your testing suite isn't extremely robust. And having 100% test coverage doesn't really mean your testing suite is doing anything worthwhile. You must look beyond the numbers and focus on the quality of those tests. You need rock solid automated testing if you're going to deploy every commit to production. You need a solid code review process to ensure multiple sets of eyes have looked at the code from whatever review criteria your teams have set up. The requirements that you have for releasing software can and should be codified as much as possible and placed into a pipeline of some sort. It's important that you break your pipeline into separate, distinct phases. This is so that you can give your developers rapid feedback, and feedback here is the key word, on their pipeline execution and to assist in pinpointing where the process has broken down. All right, ready for the fifth anti-pattern? It's alert fatigue. It's one of the most common ones and the easiest one to fix as well. This anti-pattern focuses on aspects on on-call life for the teams. How often have you had only one dedicated person or two dedicated people being on call, and then they're the most tired ones during the day? They lack focus because of all the alarm noise or lower response times, low effectiveness, and many useless alerts because they've been awakened during the night at 3 o'clock in the morning just to see an alert come in saying CPU is 90%. But have they looked what a CPU is? Is it a database? Because most common databases have their CPUs at 90%. So alert fatigue occurs when an operator is exposed to many frequent alarms, causing the operator to become used to them. Lower response time becomes a rule as operator becomes more accustomed to false alarms. This reduces the overall effectiveness of the alerting system. So what's the solution here from the DevOps perspective? You have to have alerts, but you have to have good alerts. What is a good alert? Good alert combines out of three possible ingredients. It's actionable, it's timely, and it's properly prioritized. What's actionable alert? Actionable alert is when the alert triggers, it should point to the problem and the path for the solution. The solution should be defined in the alert message or in the runbook. Linking directly to the runbook inside of the alert notification eliminates the difficulty of finding the correct runbook for a given scenario, especially at 3 o'clock in the morning. Timely, the alert does as little forecasting on the impact as possible. When the alert fires, you feel confident that you need to investigate it immediately versus waiting 5 minutes to see if the alert clears on its own. Properly prioritized, it's easy to forget that alerts do not always have to wake someone in the middle of the night. For alerts that are needed for awareness, convert those to lower priority notification methods, such as email. The empty toolbox. This anti-pattern is about identifying the problems with not investing in automation of tools that support your ability to deliver your product. For example, you have most important databases on certain servers. So your servers are the tools, for example. And those databases always get upgraded and upgraded and upgraded. Some upgrades will require newer servers, yet you don't do it. You don't invest in those. So this is the anti-pattern that talks about this. Symptoms. The focus of this anti-pattern is to identify the problems with not investing in automation of tools that support your ability to deliver your product. In so many scenarios, our urgency to get a thing done prevents us from doing things the way they should be, with proper automation and tooling. It's slower, not as effective, and it doesn't produce a result nearly as consistent. A manual process, no matter how well documented, always offers the opportunity for failure. Humans are just not built for these repetitive tasks that computers excel at. So the symptoms, as I shortened in there, the lack of investment in the tools, no plan for automation, and if all of you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So what's the DevOps approach to this? You must think beyond just a product or a feature being built when it comes to tooling and automation. You must think for the entire system around the product. Automation is no longer optional. If you're going to be successful, automation must become a priority in your project, your work, and your tools. Always think the bigger picture. That's the whole idea. All right, anti-pattern number 7, off-hours deployments. This anti-pattern focuses on the deployment process and how you can help reduce the fear of risk of deployment inside your teams. Symptoms examples: release cramming, rushed features, and crushing change control. So release cramming, the release process is so painful that teams avoid doing it regularly. This leads to larger and larger releases, making the release riskier. Rushed features, larger releases means less frequent releases. Teams might find themselves using a feature to ensure they can make it for the next release cycle. Crushing the change control, well, when you're in a rush, you have to cut corners somewhere. So when you have a larger release, they become riskier. The more risk, the bigger of the impact of the failure. The larger the impact of the failure, the tighter the process becomes with additional layers of approvals and change control heaped on top. So how can DevOps help resolve this? One of the ways you can make activity routine is to do it in a controlled environment beforehand. Practice makes perfect. The more you can make the environment like the real thing, the better and more comfortable you become, making the staging environment mimic production as closely as possible in terms of architecture and topology. If there are multiple instances of an application service on separate machines in production, the same pattern should be replicated in the staging environment. Getting more automated testing in the pipeline is going to be the baseline for any sort of automated deployment pipeline. Enforce the idea that merge requests without test cases are incomplete merge requests. Make it part of the code review process, or even better, make it part of your build pipeline. Wasting a perfectly good incident. This is one of my favorite ones. This anti-pattern is about the process and structure of post-mortem, as well as how to get a deeper understanding of your system by asking deeper, more probing questions about why engineers decided to take the action that they did. If you haven't figured it by now, this whole presentation is one big post-mortem about all the issues that happen in DevOps. So symptoms, there's a very obvious blame game. There is no understanding of why systems perform the way they do because of the blame game, and then no continuous improvement on the team level, because what team is focusing on is just making sure sending those emails to cover their behinds. That's the only thing they do. So how can DevOps help here? With the blameless culture, the attention shifts from everyone attempting to deflect blame to solving the problems and gaps in knowledge that led to the incident. Focus and try to build mental models. What are mental models? A mental model is an explanation of someone's thought process about how something works. The mental model might detail someone's perception of the relationship and interaction between components, as well as how the behavior of one component might influence other components, generating action items that further the improvement. All right, so anti-pattern number 9, information hoarding. I think this is the most common of all the DevOps anti-pattern. Only Brent knows, or only John knows, or whoever that person is. In this anti-pattern, I'm going to talk about how information hoarding happens and hopefully how to pivot away from it through structured activities that almost any organization can adopt. So there's always a single point of failure. There's lack of information sharing. There's always access restriction, and then documentation is based on departments. So how you share information is always going to be a blueprint for how you communicate as a team and how you draw the lines of responsibility and ownership. Access restrictions start off with the best of intentions, but if they're not carefully monitored, they can quickly spiral onto an overprotective police state. In many organizations, nowhere is there a complete document highlighting the entire process from start to finish. Instead, each department splinters into its own groups and writes documentation that addresses their specific area or focus on the process. And in that case, if a department that gets the documentation from that other department that wrote the documentation does not understand most of it. So how can DevOps help here? Obviously, start with clear communication is number one. But what is clear communication? Starting with a clear topic is the first step of communication. Once your topic is defined, you'll want to think about who you plan to communicate to. Understanding who you're speaking to will help you choose the level of depth your topic must go into and some bits of knowledge. Once you have the topic defined and your audience selected, structuring your key points is next. Creating a common lexicon and naming strategy for business processes, services, systems, and tools isn't really meant for the 15-year-old veterans that are working in this company. It's designed for new people. It's designed for also junior resources that are part of this company and whoever new comes in. The master document should focus on a process, application, or a system and provide a jumping off point for any specific departmental information if necessary. Documentation should form a hierarchical structure leading back to the master document that it covers, and that master document should be concise and specific about the topic. Another thing that is encouraged with the introduction of master documents is that idea that your documentation should be structured around the topic instead of a department. All right, there's just a couple of more left. Culture by decree. A lot of times this anti-pattern kind of slides onto unknown, but I made sure it's covered here because one of the big topics, one of the big pillars about DevOps is culture. So this anti-pattern talks about structure behind a company's culture and how you can help influence it. I'm pretty sure you heard very often that a company that has a bar, has free drinks, that has very common parties, a lot of parties, great culture. But in the back end, they hire anyone that can do the job. And most of the times, a lot of people do not fit together. Fit, keyword there. So culture goes beyond the fun activities at the office parties and the whole variety of gluten-free snacks provided in the break room. Cultural values, however, do not exist in a vacuum. Values are just declarations without action. Cultural norms are the activities that bring cultural values into something tangible. Cultural values without cultural norms are just empty platitudes. So how can DevOps help here? When you interact with other teams, you want to use the language that is clear. Explicitly separate hard facts from perspectives or opinions that are drawn from the facts. Use phrasing that opens the room for debate, not close. Establish the end goal of your action. Don't just start talking for the sake of talking. Culture sets the tone how the work is done, and hire with your company culture and organizational fit in mind. All right, and then the very last anti-pattern is too many yardsticks. This anti-pattern is about prioritizing tasks and how tasks can be changed on a daily basis and sprints lose their meaning. So what are the symptoms? Many teams tend not to coalesce around the overall goal, but instead around their specific slice of the goal. That slice gets prioritized above overall team goal. As the slice becomes more specific, so do the ways in which you measure them. Before long, you have a bunch of different means of measuring the performance of the teams, and those means may incentivize behavior that distracts from the overall goal. This is the too many yardsticks anti-pattern. So there are no clear goal sets, just deploy stuff. There are no measurable objectives, and then there's a lot of unplanned work. So how can DevOps help? Knowing your goals and how they factor into the larger set of our organizational goal is for many people, and I would say most people, an influencer of job satisfaction. Knowing that their work matters and is impactful to people outside of the organization can be an enormous team motivator. When it comes to individuals, commitments are the currency of credibility. When someone commits to something, you instantly do a calculation on the person's credibility. And some of my personal tips: refusing a task is more professional than accepting it and never doing it. And also, unless you have a complete control over your work and prioritization of your work, you never want to offer commitments that you may have no control over honoring. This is important not only for the requester, but for your own personal reputation in the organization. And lastly, let's conclude this. So what did I talk about? I covered DevOps 4 pillars at the beginning, or shortly said, CAMs. What are CAMs? Culture is about changing the norms. Automation is about freeing the human capital from the mundane. Metrics, well, it's how you see stuff. And then sharing is the idea that knowledge wants to be free. We also looked at some failures, and then I tried to help you turn those failures into the opportunities. We drove the change through culture. We put together what's most important, so people are most important than everything else. We broke down the knowledge silos. It's especially between different teams, different departments. And then we settled middle management turf wars about the priorities. And as I promised, at the end, I want to recommend everybody a book if you're interested in this topic, and talk about DevOps Antipatterns, and then DevOps in general, if you're a beginner and even more developed in DevOps, how DevOps works. Operations Antipatterns, DevOps Solutions by Jeffrey Smith. A lot of these antipatterns I've covered today are also mentioned in that book, but he has mentioned way more than I could cover today. So that's all from me. I hope you enjoyed this. This was about DevOps Antipatterns. Thank you, everybody, and have a great day.